Welcome to another episode of the Love Not Fear podcast. Today on the topic of when values get real. We will talk ego, we will talk power, we will talk culture. And my special guest today is Heather Stevens.
Hello.
Hello, organizational design and development specialist with a background in political science and cultural change. And I'm really, really happy that you are with me here today. Heather, welcome.
Thank you, Tina. I really appreciate getting the invitation and getting to talk about these topics. These are things that I'm very curious about. So I can give a short introduction. As you said, I have a background in political science. So I have 3 degrees in political science. I studied basically political development and institutional change. So that is kind of how processes and authority evolve in conjunction with culture and history. And then I sort of accidentally ended up in a tech company, and I found that my interest in political theory was very applicable to navigating organizational dynamics. And then since then, I've worked in agile roles and also org development, sort of focused on helping people grapple with how do they build structure and process to get things done and solve problems together.
So you do all the important work. Bottom line.
Yeah, I try. Yeah.
I would like to dive right in with you. I've had different kind of people on the podcast, but we have actually not too much talked about what is culture actually, right?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people talk about culture, but they don't have sort of a clear handle on what it really means. I think you hear a lot about problems in organizations, and people have a sense that there's something wrong. I see people behaving in a way that I think is not constructive. There must be a problem with culture. And this comes together with sometimes an assumption, well, the structure's fine. The problem is with the culture. And I think that those two things are not really separable. So the definition of culture that I use comes from actually a company called Nopal, which does organizational change management consulting. And they define culture as an emergent property of interpersonal interaction mediated by the organization's environment, purpose, strategies, structures, and systems. And the reason that I like that definition is that it defines culture as emergent. So culture is an outcome. An emergent quality is something that arises from a collective but isn't displayed by any of the individuals alone. It's something that is a kind of a byproduct of other things. So in the environment, that could be the culture, the time that you live in, the country that you live in, your education, the industry, any number of things. And then structure, systems, processes, those are kind of how is the organization built, how is authority exercised, all of those kind of things. And so there's this idea of the relationship between culture and structure. And one of the things that you hear a lot in our field as kind of a throwaway line is culture follows structure. And so the idea is if you change your structure, then behavior will change. Well, I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. I think that culture is indeed an outcome of structure, but structure is also embedded in culture. So it's kind of more like a reciprocal relationship where the structures that we build we are only able to conceive of that structure because of how our mind is set, our mental model of what an organization should look like, what our goals are, what our purpose is, and so on. But I think the reason that you end up getting that kind of bifurcation is because the structure is the thing that we sort of think we can get our hands around. Well, I can change the org chart, but I can't really I mean, many companies try to do this, but you can't really just tell people to change their behavior and have that actually result in anything. Or it may backfire if you take that kind of approach.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on the mental model and give us an example?
So a mental model is kind of like the paradigm that you operate in that is sort of like the lived reality that you have and the assumptions that you're making and the way that you define terms and things like that. So if I have, let me think, if I have like a mental model of software development,
Mm-hmm.
I might think there are certain things that are good that we're supposed to be doing, and there are certain things that are bad, and there are certain things that are just facts and true and reality. Things like, well, we should do iterative development. We should be focused on our user needs. We should have self-organizing teams. We
Mm-hmm.
should use these specific processes of how we are working together.
Mm-hmm.
And those are things, that's a value system that exists if you exist in that kind of subculture of like
Mm-hmm.
agile software development, for instance, where they elevate certain things and criticize other things, but those are not things that are like objective facts, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're outside of that subculture, you might have no idea what any of that is about.
Right.
And so that's a challenge, I think, in a lot of organizations that people will have because of their education, because of their personal experience, because of sort of, the values that are taught when you learn sales are different than the values that are taught when you learn like knowledge work. And
Mm-hmm.
so if you need a salesperson and a software developer to work together, they might be living in totally different realities. And so they could have conflicts that arise from that, but they maybe don't know why they're having conflicts. And the reason is they're making different assumptions. They're thinking different things are good or bad. And they've kind of become so normalized in the individual that they are invisible at a certain point. So
Mm.
I really believe that it's a key role of leaders to kind of cohere mental models, to surface and make explicit, this is how we see the world, and not necessarily to, well, certainly not, I would say, actually, to homogenize those things,
Mm.
because the difference of perspective is very valuable,
Mm-hmm.
but to understand where, oh, I am coming at this from this perspective because this is my experience and my belief, but you are coming at it with a different view because of X, Y, and Z. Cool. How do we make a decision together?
So it's more like a, let's say, like a conversation starter to explore together in a certain direction.
Yeah. And I think it's a really crucial way to enable change to occur
Mm-hmm.
is to sort of pull everybody into that same reality. And there's a lot of facilitation tools. That's a thing that I'm very into, of how do you kind of surface those problem framings and those assumptions and those different views without trying to necessarily like elevate one above the other or
Mm.
make them all the same, but just kind of bring them together at the points that you need something to happen.
You pointed out a very, very important aspect, which is diversity of perspectives within a culture, right? And I think obviously this is like in every system we are part of right now, this is like one of the biggest kind of challenges to put it in like easy words. um, but could you give us maybe an example, or like how would you make that happen? Like to actually nurture a ground where different kind of perspectives, and with that, I believe also different kind of needs, potentially different kind of values can coexist.
So it's a good question. And it's something that I try to do and kind of embody every day in my work, because I
Mm-hmm.
find that creating that kind of consistency and congruence is very important to have credibility and to establish sort of safety for people in
Mm-hmm.
a space. So one of the first teams that I worked with as a Scrum Master many years ago was a team that had a really hard time making decisions. They disagreed about absolutely everything. We would have hours and hours of
Oh.
discussions and debates over the most minor of topics. And after a while, I learned a couple of things that of sort of what was underlying this and how to navigate it in a way that didn't mute their expertise and their value that they were bringing to that team dynamic. And one of the reasons that they were debating endlessly was that there were no stakes, was that they knew that in that company, the CEO, who was the founder, would get frustrated after too much discussion and would just say, we're doing this. Fine. We're doing this. And even if they would actually come to a decision, that person might come later and be like, no, you're not doing that. You're doing this. And so at that point, it's like, well, there's not really any like pressure or there's no stakes. If we make a decision, he's going to override it anyway. So we're going to
Yeah,
sit
of
in here
course.
and we're just going to keep talking. And the other part of that, of course, is that you need to learn to make decisions and feel the impact of those decisions in order to learn to make better decisions. You need to sort of feel what it's like to make a bad decision in order to kind of learn that and get that sort of feedback cycle going. And so one of the things that was lucky in that scenario was that I had a really good working relationship with that CEO and founder. So at some point I just told him, please get out of my meeting. And I was able to do that. And I was also able to kind of give him the feedback and coach him a little bit on this is the dynamic I'm seeing. And I understand that you're frustrated with seeing this sort of in action, but this is the impact of what happens. And it's actually a pattern I've observed quite frequently in working with managers and executives since then, is that they see that debate discussion, that muddling through, that people kind of having difficulty seeing eye to eye and grappling with concepts and taking a long time to draw out these things, and they think something is wrong rather than this is just part of the process.
Right.
And so they think, oh, well, they're disagreeing, we need to move fast, we need to deliver, or I know better than them, so I will just tell them what the decision it should be. But when you do that, you're depriving your team of the ability to learn what I think is probably the most important skill for teams to learn, which is disagreeing and still making a decision. And if you do it for them, then they will learn that habit of like, well, I don't have to make the decision then. And it just kind of postpones that learning process. But if you let them do it, the first time is hard. The first time we sat through, I remember our first sprint planning with this team, it was like 6 hours. It was miserable. But I was like, we are not leaving this room until you guys make a decision.
You can be brutal, Heather.
But again, it's about kind of like reading the room and the people, and like the people really had trust in me as well. So I was able to kind of exercise that license.
Oh, good.
And every next time it got easier. So
Right.
I'm not technical. I don't have an engineering background, but they would get into these little disagreements about whatever, how we should configure something, whatever it was. And I remember they would chat at each other on our company Slack, and they would just be arguing and arguing and arguing. And then they would come to me privately and be like, do you believe this guy? Do you see what he's doing? He's so difficult. And there were a few things that I did very intentionally in that moment. And one was I refused to take the side of anybody.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't like say, yeah, he's really a pain back to the person. I would, because I didn't see that as my role. I would try to get them to empathize with the other person. And then we also just developed some team rules as we went. We acknowledged, hey, we have a problem with this. We have a lot of disagreement. How do we want to handle this? And so we would periodically reflect and develop simple rules. And one of those was, if you guys are debating in the Slack channel for more than 15 minutes, drop it. Pick it up the next day face to face. And sleeping on things is always good. So there is that element, I think, of like confronting the reality of how difficult it is and not avoiding that. And then emphasizing how important it is that we figure this out and we learn this skill. And then this is where I think a good facilitator can be really powerful, because they can bring in little tools where, I mean, I've had this happen multiple times where and I think this is maybe a reality of working with software engineers as well, because they can be quite opinionated, where they will just be arguing and arguing and arguing. And then I will say, hey guys, maybe let's just take a vote and see where everybody stands. And then they all vote the same way. And I'm like, you guys all agree on what we should do. Why are we still sitting here arguing? And there is like a little bit of that where if you kind of reveal or slice off a piece of a decision, then you can at least like move on to the next point. And what I notice with these teams is that the more they kind of wrestle with each other, the easier it gets.
Mm-hmm.
And the more they trust the
Mm-hmm.
other person's viewpoint, and they trust that, like, you bring a different value to this team than I have. You have a different perspective than I have. So after a year with this team, the initial team I was describing, I remember they were still arguing or debating, disagreeing, but they were like laughing together while they did it. And
Mm.
they were showing like memes on each other's phones in our planning. And so it was like, it's fun. And that's something that I actually really enjoy, is building that kind of strong relationship with a
Yes.
coworker or someone where you can really like get into the details and you can disagree with them, but you know that the foundation is so strong that
Mm-hmm.
it's not like they're going to think that you don't like them anymore at the end, or that you're trying to like manipulate them or something like that.
Like sitting in discomfort. I'm just like, I'm wondering because I'm like picturing like people like 15 minutes or more debating in the Slack channel. And I'm like thinking, you must feel quite safe already to speak up in that kind of way, right? And to go back and forth and to actually debate. Because I think what we've been seeing in cultures is like we have a lot of quiet cultures as well, right? Where the
Yes.
whisper is happening behind the back, and you're like, huh, hang on, what's your bug? I don't know, like what's bugging you? So what do you do to create like this kind of safety first?
I think that's a really good point. Because I have worked at a company where I remember thinking and saying to the leaders after a few months that there is a suspicious lack of conflict in this organization, that everyone seems to agree and everyone seems to think
Mm-hmm.
everything is great.
Mm-hmm.
And then at some point, I noticed that it was exactly due to what you're saying. There was a lack of safety. And so you would
Mm.
ask someone's opinion about something, and you would watch like an emotional process cross over their face where they had their first reaction, and then they paused, and then they thought of something nice to say, and then
Mm-hmm.
that's what they would say instead of sharing
Mm-hmm.
their real opinion.
Right.
And in those environments, I think you have to figure out what the source of the lack of safety is, because it's
Mm-hmm.
not going to just go away on its own. And sometimes you really have to look for it. In the best case scenario, it's a well meaning manager or executive who just doesn't realize that this is the effect that is happening based on their behavior. If maybe it's like a body language or a face that they make when somebody criticizes something.
Mm.
Um, I worked with an executive who would, when told problems, he would say, well, why isn't anybody telling me this? I'm so open, I'm so friendly, I'm so nice. But I knew from personal experience that if I brought him a problem, he would just like physically, you could see him get defensive and his voice would change. And he would like just, he wouldn't necessarily mean to, but he would just kind of like, I know, Heather.
Yes.
and so, and so in that situation, you can't really, I think as a leader, especially a higher up leader, you really do have a responsibility of like, how am I coming across? Like, what is it that I'm unconsciously deterring or
Mm-hmm.
rewarding? And I want
Exactly.
to reward people bringing tough questions and raising problems and highlighting areas where things are not right. I don't want to make them feel like they cannot do that or that they will be punished for that. And so, in those situations, there is an amount of kind of making it visible to them,
Mm-hmm.
helping them to understand it. And then, if it's someone who, has the capacity of self awareness and really earnestly wants to improve, then there are, like activities that can be done. There's a lot of books about this, to highlight what is the impact that the leaders is having on
Mm-hmm.
the problems that they see. Because very often, if you're a leader and you see a pattern of a problem in your organization, which is not like just one off, but like something that is repeating over and over again with different people over different periods of time, the first place to look is in the mirror of what
Huh.
am I doing to create an environment where this is the thing that is rewarded or not. Now, unfortunately, there are situations where there's a toxic leader,
Mm-hmm.
and that's why there's no safety, because it is indeed not safe. And in that situation, which I think is quite difficult to grapple with if you are someone like us, um, because I'm someone who really has a hard time not calling out stuff that's happening right in front of me, but that can often make you a target in those kind of organizations. Um, in those situations, teaching people to stand up and, raise their hand when something is wrong and call things out, it can legitimately be unsafe for them to do that.
Mhm.
So you have to kind of think, how do I be effective in this atmosphere while, not inadvertently bringing harm to people who cannot
Mhm.
afford to like lose their job or something like that. And then you have to make a decision for yourself of, can I tolerate this? Because
Mhm.
I've been in situations where I was supporting a leadership team where the CEO was this kind of person who was very toxic and not self-aware and seemed to be playing out kind of parent-child dynamics
Mhm.
with the employees, which is also very common.
Mhm.
Um, and the stuff he would say in private meetings was really just awful. And he seemed to almost take pleasure in like scaring people.
Oh wow.
So in that situation, I'm like, if I work with this guy, I'm complicit.
Mhm.
If I support, if I back him up, if I provide him with my expertise in order to form this organization, to design and develop this organization to make him richer,
Yeah,
then
exactly.
I'm complicit. And so by leaving that organization, like they still exist, they're doing fine. And I said this to a lot of my colleagues when I left, was like, I can't stop them from doing this, but I don't have to be part of it. I don't have to
Exactly.
give them my energy for, one more second.
And it's also, I mean,
But
like,
those are hard questions.
protecting your own integrity at some point, right? And that's why I value my own core values so much and like to nurture them, because I have been like very value driven like all my life, right? I just didn't know. Like I didn't put words to it. I didn't make it very
Yeah.
visible for myself for a long time. But now it's like such a good kind of like check in with yourself. Okay, inner compass, like where we are at. This feels very, very off. Cannot
Yeah.
put the finger on it, so I'm gonna go into observation, right? So where does it really hurt? So what is that? Okay, let's explore. Let's maybe ask some people. Do they experience the same thing? Yes, no. Okay, maybe it's just me, you know? But like it's like on an individual level, I think you have like this kind of responsibility for yourself, and that's the agency and accountability that lies with you to make the right decisions, to set the right boundaries for yourself, because like this, you are also sending a very clear signal. And this is how we are also creating very healthy cultures, right? Now, on organizational level, we have like these attempts, let's say, in putting values on paper, or even we make, I don't know, workshops, and then you do like the rounds, and people talk about it, and they interpret these kind of values however they want to interpret them, because obviously values are also something very individual, as well as mission, purpose, because it's very much open for interpretation. So, for example, David, my business
Yeah. Yeah.
partner, David Hensel, he keeps talking about like they had like one value in like one of his previous companies, which was like building cool shit. And they wanted to. I also always laugh about it, but it worked for them. It
Yeah.
somehow worked because they opened up the conversation, and they attracted the developers and the people they wanted to attract. And obviously, it was a little bit like, oh, some people they don't want to even put like the word shit in their mouth, so they kind of like want to like drive these people away. I would never do that, you know what I mean? So it worked for them, but like in my own experience, it was more like we've been like sitting down. I mean, like obviously I visited Zappos, right? 5 or 6 times. I was,
Yeah.
just like to also explore what are they doing, because obviously they have like this great culture, and it's like based on their, I think it's 9 or 11 core values, and I don't know how it is now. It was still like under Tony Shea, right? And God bless him, he passed. But a very value driven culture. And to the people you talk to, they had different kind of interpretations of these values as well, naturally, right?
Yeah.
So we tried to do the same thing with us, and then we did something that was pretty crazy. We let people go because of not being value aligned. So
Mm-hmm.
now you're like establishing something, and then you make like a top down kind of thing out of it, because you say, well, you are not value aligned, and the person is like, why would I not be value aligned? Like, what are you talking about? It's like, yeah, I think there's a door you, you should leave, you know. That's like crazy. Like, we have experimented and trialed like all these kind of things, but now you're like entering an organization, you are getting a sense of the culture, you're meeting these people, you're getting a feel for what to expect, and then there are values. Okay, they're like on the homepage, and they're also hopefully in the culture somewhere. So you're going into psychological contract, and then you're in, and then at some point you figure, wait a minute, that's not actually what I signed up for, you know, in the first
Mm-hmm.
place. And but how do you then speak up? And what do you do then, right? I mean, like, you try to speak up, and then it's like, okay, you know, the dream has busted. You know, things are not how I expected it, but it feels like all the people around me, they're fine somehow, or they start also talking
Yeah.
behind each other's backs and say, yeah, this is actually shit what's been going on here. But, you know, I don't know, the organizational purpose is just bigger of what our personal needs are at. So we just keep going, right? And I think that's the moment when you really get to know people. When people are showing their integrity, where people are embodying integrity, when they are embodying the values like, you know, you shared potentially in the beginning. And that's like in crisis situations that can play out in many different ways. But I would love to talk to you a little bit deeper about that topic, because I feel like this is happening very often.
Yeah.
And it feels like that also just the few, or actually not many, can really navigate these kind of situations. And in particular, also leadership teams, I feel,
Yeah.
or other people in the organization. And I think fear plays a very big role in that.
So, there's a lot of things here. I think where I will start is I read a paper, I think it was last year or the year before, but it was written in the 90s, and it was written about the idea of corporate culture programs and
Mm-hmm.
culture transformation programs, because in the 90s is when this started to become a big thing of attracting employees to your company because of your values and your culture. And the framing that this paper used was it drew kind of an intellectual history from the very coercive scientific management practices of the earlier 20th century,
Mm-hmm.
where where management was all about control and
Mm-hmm.
coercion and exploitation and things like this. And that the idea of corporate values was really just an extension of that, but done in a way that kind of internalized the coercive mechanism based on shame and inclusion.
Right.
And so the idea was that employees would start to police themselves because, well, don't you want to be part of our culture? You don't want to, be a bad culture warrior.
Mm-hmm.
And that this really just played into the same kind of exploitative mechanisms as capitalism has always been built on. And
Mm.
so it was, but it almost was more insidious because it became more about kind of like almost like brainwashing. And if you've ever been in a big corporate like values seminar, it really feels like you're in North Korea and it's like a propaganda session where, here's the great leader and we are this, we are great, we are excellent, these are our values, all
Mm.
hail our values. And it's almost like a cult. Um, and I think that, I honestly think that there are some people in that situation that are just like, you know what? I need a job. I'm going to keep my head down, whatever. I don't listen to any of that stuff. And then there are some people that I think you and I are like, because I identify a lot the same, that I've always been someone who really needed to like live my truth, and that I'm
Mm.
very viscerally uncomfortable if I'm asked to be dishonest in any way in
Mm-hmm.
terms of like presenting a different face or pretending that a problem is not real or pretending that this company is really about teamwork and innovation when I know that it's actually a super toxic environment. And so I think there are certain people that are just not able to sort of cope with that level of um, dissidence is a good word, um, because it's a pattern that you also see in like authoritarian regimes in the world, where there are certain people who are dissidents with a T,
Mm-hmm.
um, and those people, they often are just driven by wanting to live an authentic life and wanting to kind of be free in a society that insists that they conform and that they homogenize themselves and that they mute their special characteristics. And that a lot, if you read about, I was reading an article about the dissidents in like the Soviet Union and Iran and some other oppressive regimes, and they were not driven by like a particularly political project, like this is how we want to reform the government. They were just driven by, well, you keep saying this is a democracy, so I'm going to act like this is a democracy and I'm going to speak my mind. And then often, they face great punishment for that. In a
Mm-hmm.
company, the punishment can be that you're fired. I think that idea of not being a culture fit is something that is really weaponized, especially with the mass layoffs that we've seen in the last couple of
Mm-hmm.
years.
Yeah.
And that so often, and I've heard this kind of said really cynically by a lot of people that I've worked with, of like, oh, those values are just propaganda. They're just like organizational gaslighting. Like they say that they want us to, speak truth, but then if you actually do it, you get punished. So
Yeah.
I think there is some of that about if you're in an organization like that, assessing to what degree you have the ability to shift things. Because in some organizations, they are so big and the belief system is so deep and pervasive that you can kind of assess, how am I going to fare here? And so, one of the things I encourage people to ask and observe when they join a new company is, what kind of things are rewarded around here? What
Mm.
kind of
Mm-hmm.
things are, where do you see, what kind of people are thriving in this environment? What gets you promoted around here? So
Mm-hmm.
when I like to do assessments of like stated values versus operationalized values in companies. And when I do that, I will highlight these tension points of, well, you say this is important to you, but this is what you're promoting for. You're
Mm-hmm.
promoting your leaders because they're really good at managing up and they're really good at telling a story that looks good on the company all hands. But their employee engagement survey results are trash.
Mm-hmm.
Or you're saying that you favor diversity, but your whole leadership team is the
Mm-hmm.
same, color, gender, background. Um, and there are those things that I think a lot of people will unconsciously sense that friction and it just makes you uncomfortable, like it's a weird wavelength frequency in the environment. And then there's ways of like really highlighting and making those things explicit. So if you're in an organization where there is a possibility to shift things, I think making them visible is always the first step of like
Mm-hmm.
showing, hey, this is what's really going on, this is what you're really rewarding. Is that what you want? If you want to reward, or if you want a culture that values experimentation and innovation, well, you better be rewarding failure, because otherwise nobody's going to want to experiment.
Yeah,
You better be
exactly.
like cheerleading when somebody tries something bold and it totally flops,
Yeah.
if that's really what you want, because that's what that takes. And so I do think a lot of the kind of corporate values initiatives, I mean, I think part of this is that they are sold as like a magical cure to
Mm.
all of the problems in a company, but also that they end up quite disconnected from other things in the organization. And they are not necessarily connected to like this is our company purpose, this is the environment we operate in, what do we actually need to nurture in order to be successful? So like I worked with a team once where they had some values, and one of them was stability and reliability, and the other was innovation. And I pointed out, like, these might be in tension though, right? And they just didn't really think about it, because you think, well, stability, reliability, yeah, that's good. Innovation, yeah, that's good. Yeah, but if you're innovating, if you're constantly pushing the
Yes.
boundaries of deploying the latest technology, things are going to break. So, what's more important in that situation? And in the end, they were like, well, actually, stability and reliability are more important. Okay, well, then you're probably going to be running an old version of something sometimes if it's more stable. But I think those kind of like explicit trade off conversations don't happen a lot, because I think part of it is that they are tough conversations to get into. They will uncover problems that people don't want to acknowledge. And then the other part of it is that I think that there's a lot of folks out there who don't really care. They just think, no, just give me the values and then everything will be good. Give me
Yeah.
the secret cure. Give me the magic beans and then
Yeah.
I'm all set.
I start there. There's one thing. You were talking about like cult like cultures. And you're hitting a spot with me, obviously, on that, right? It's like one of the topics I really like to go deep into it because of my own experiences, right? And what we had created, it was like a cult like
Mhm.
bubble, right? In terms of beliefs, in terms how we were all aligned and how we viewed also the world around us, right? So how did we view our suppliers, customers, and competitors, and so forth? So we were like, better in our belief, and we had way better intentions and stuff. And I mean, like, bottom line, we never had bad intentions. We just developed to that point because I think we applied all there is around values, purpose, mission, vision, everything on collective level, everything aligning, the language, very, very important part, right? And just overdid it. So my question to
Yeah.
you is, how can we hold each other accountable? What are we falling back on that is really helping us to stay connected? Also honor individuality, so make the coexistence of needs and perspectives really like bringing that to life within the social system of an organization, but
Mhm.
being in a situation of conflict, being in a situation of crisis, like what is there that helps us to have like something like a frame or something, we're falling back on.
So, are you saying if you're in like a particular situation in a team or an organization or whatever, and you kind of perceive a threat, and the instinct that people have tends to be to sort of smooth over difference and kind
or,
of
or to
hunker
just
down?
keep it simple, like there's a customer and some of the people respond to the customer in like a questionable way, like
Okay.
I don't know, like yells at the customer or says nothing you're saying is true. I don't know, or maybe let's say maybe there's some kind of racist kind of reaction
Yeah.
to the customer, because I think that's a very good example. Like,
Yeah.
how would you make sure? I mean, I know it's a good example, but it's also a very complex topic to go into. But how would you make sure as an organization to treat this topic in a way that makes sense? Like, a lot of times it's before we are entering a work agreement or a collaboration agreement or a partnership agreement, we're looking into our shared values, our shared purpose, our shared whatever. But as mentioned before, it's very much up for interpretation. So I'm wondering, like, how, and also, not only that, but also trying to align so much that you are actually driving individuality out of the window. That's like the
Mhm.
other risk, right? So not understanding is the one, because it's just too vague. Everybody has a different kind of interpretation. The other one is
Yeah.
we're like trying to align and we overdo it, and then we creating like a monoculture. But what we want is diversity, but we still want to be able to hold each other accountable in a certain kind of, context. So aren't you then like, you need to find some common ground, right?
Yeah.
And some tolerance ground, I guess, if we
Yeah.
talk about diversity.
Well, I think that if you start from a basic precondition that everyone needs to treat each other with a certain standard of respect,
Mm.
then there is a lot of flexibility that goes beyond that in terms of beliefs that you have about the work you're doing, and even political beliefs or other things of that nature. Um, I think that uh, meeting things with curiosity is a big part of it, because it's easy for us to make a lot of assumptions when someone
Mm-hmm.
will make a certain statement and you'll think, oh, what's behind that? I've heard that statement said by someone else who I don't like or disagree with in another context, or I think is bad. I
Mm.
think if you assume that people have a capacity to learn and view things differently, then you can then kind of view that those differences of perspective as learning opportunities. But I do think you also have to draw a line at some point, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like racism is a thing that I would say you kind of have to draw a red line at that point, because
Mm-hmm.
that's
Yeah.
showing disrespect towards individuals. But uh when I have worked in, um, I think, I mean, one thing to think about is, in my experience, the people who are like the smartest and the most kind of fanatically obsessive about
Mm-hmm.
their skill and their trade, those people are often kind of difficult to deal with, because they are, I mean, that's what makes them uniquely skilled and uniquely talented, is that
Mm.
they are a little bit anti-conformist. And so you do have to, I think you can kind of together co-create what is the level of flexibility that is allowable for this person to really deviate from norms,
Mm-hmm.
in order to observe, like, okay, well, I want them to succeed and flourish in this environment, but not at the expense of other people. So I worked with an engineer once who was really kind of a genius, and he would stay up until like 4 a.m. creating like just crazy brand new solutions to problems that we had. Well, we had like we had flexible hours, but not that flexible
Mm-hmm.
of hours. But basically what I did was I just made an agreement with him of like, hey, if you're going to stay up till 4 a.m., which I don't like that you're working until 4 a.m., but if you insist on doing it because those are your most creative hours, then you at least need to be available for this meeting, and this meeting. And I will
Mm-hmm.
put them in the afternoon because I don't want you not getting enough sleep.
Yeah.
But it was still, so it was a situation that was like, it kind of made things a little bit complicated sometimes, but at the same time, he was bringing a lot of value, and he was someone who was very self-aware and like giving and committed into the
Right.
company. But then I've also encountered people who were so perfectionist and so difficult to work with that it was just, we just could not accommodate their kind of quirks and their deviation from the like, they were engaged in behavior that like they just pissed everybody off. And they were, and you do, I think you have to give people the benefit of the doubt. You have to go through the process of giving each other feedback, um, helping them to try and see how their behavior is received by others, helping them to be able to express clearly what they are feeling
Mm.
and what they need from the environment. And then sometimes you decide, hey, it looks like we need different things for each other that cannot be reconciled. And then you
Mm.
can make a, humane and fair decision to separate at that point. And a lot of those times, it's something that is just mutually understood, rather than, well, this person doesn't conform, we have to push them out. And we can't
Mm.
actually talk to them about it because they're a bad person and we have to get them out of our atmosphere. So I do think there's like there's a kind of acceptable margin, and that's going to be different for every company. It's even going to be different by industry, right? Because there's some
Mm,
companies where it's a very low ability to take risks because it's highly regulated,
right.
or there's major like safety security concerns, and everybody kind of has to like behave in a common way. But
Yes.
then there's other companies where, I mean, like I would never work for a company that was like that, because that's not my, I like rules to be flexible. So I'm not going to be
Mm.
very good in an environment where
Well,
rules cannot be flexible.
but it can also coexist under one roof, right? So when I worked in oil
Yeah.
and gas, we had like this super highly regulated industry and so many rules, right?
Yeah.
Not much, not there was really not much flexibility or space to, you know, but I was not necessarily like impacted by that in like communications and organizational culture and like more like internal but also like external roles in terms of communication. But so I think it can coexist under one roof. So you have like the
Yeah.
engineers, they were really like, okay, that's what they had to deal with. And then
Yeah.
on the other hand, we had like a completely different department that was like, okay,
Yeah.
whatever,
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
But
But you also asked, how do we like hold each other accountable in those
exactly.
situations?
Mm-hmm.
I do think that there is no real shortcut for this kind of thing, and that it very much depends on, and this is what makes management so difficult, is, or one of the things, I guess, is it depends so much on building relationships and building like
Mm-hmm.
um, strong interpersonal relationships that are with specific people. And you only get there by navigating tough situations, by working on problems together, by, going through it together, essentially, so that you can say, and there's ways of building like an apparatus or a scaffolding around this. So like, if you do like a team chartering exercise, or you are um, regularly reflecting with your team. I recently did an exercise with one of my teams where we defined rules of engagement,
Mm-hmm.
and that is related to what are the things that we make trade-offs about,
Mm-hmm.
where we find it more valuable to do this even over this. But then it was also stuff like, well, we want to be able to be really open and just say what we think and not have to like polish off what we're saying. And luckily, with a team of a lot of Dutch people, that is kind of easy because they are accustomed to being direct. But then you state it right there and you say,
You
hey, in
must
this
love them.
team, I can just say, I'm in a bad mood today. You know what I mean? You can say, like, I don't feel good today. Stop doing that. Those kind of things. But that element of, you definitely have to have like the trust and flexibility with someone to point out, like,
Mm,
hey, you're exhibiting this bias right now in the situation. And that takes time, and that takes intentionality of building that and reminding people, hey, we agreed to these things, but then also being flexible about, maybe this agreement doesn't serve us anymore,
yeah.
or if someone is hurt by something, then maybe we need to shift it. But another thing that we haven't really talked about is that all of this stuff really only works if everyone is coming to it in good faith. As soon as
Mm,
you have one or multiple people who are really interested in their own power, or their own, like just themselves,
mm-hmm.
and who are, maybe dishonest or manipulative, then it becomes very difficult to have this kind of openness and collaboration, because you never know, like, oh, well, she's saying that here, but what is she going to say behind my back, or whatever.
Mm, yeah. No, that makes sense. Let's talk a little bit about power and ego, I think. Let's do ego.
Okay.
Because I also feel like you talked about this engineer, right? The genius, and you said like, but he's very self-aware, so this is why we can easily make agreements and such. But I feel like with the geniuses, you have a lot of times also very like a lot of ego, right? Which doesn't make it so easy to make agreements like this, right?
Yeah.
But ego is playing out in all kind of different forms in organizations, and I think it's really important to talk about it because we have different types of ego as well. Because there's also healthy ego, right?
Sure.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that, because I think you are the expert on it.
About healthy ego
Sounds
versus
funny. You're the expert
versus
on ego.
I will say I will say one thing, that I think that the idea of like the rock star genius asshole, I don't think most of those people are really geniuses. I think that every
Good point.
really truly like thoughtful intellectual like amazingly smart person I have ever met has also been humble,
Mm,
because they possessed the intelligence to know that they didn't know everything. And so when I've
mm,
encountered people who are like, "Oh, he's really difficult to work with, but he built this whole system and nobody else knows how it works." And then you're like, "Well, that doesn't mean he built a very good system then, if
no,
nobody else
exactly.
knows how that works." And that it often is sort of just it becomes like a trope. And I think that it becomes a trope in like very specific cultures of like Silicon Valley is really favoring of that kind of ego driven individual self aggrandizement that often gets tied in with masculinity. And being able to admit that you're wrong is, I think, something that is very important and also in a way courageous. And so when you have somebody like that, or when you have somebody, I mean, I think those people uh, are like poison to
Mm,
teams, to be honest, and that you really have to think carefully about what it is that you're trying to achieve if you want to have somebody like that stick around. Because I think that the key is not necessarily like, I think the key is the blind spot. The key is the lack of self awareness or willingness to engage in self reflection. If someone is just almost pathologically incapable of seeing that they contributed to a situation, or that they may have done something wrong, or that they have maybe made a mistake, or that there cannot be any reality except one in which everyone adapts to them,
mm-hmm,
then it's very hard to build an organization around that. Because when you build an organizational structure, when you facilitate an event, you have to be able to make certain assumptions, and one of those assumptions is nobody is trying to play this for personal gain, or at least
mm-hmm,
not to like an absurd extent, because to some extent it's okay to be a little bit self-serving. Everybody is a little bit narcissistic, but when it verges into like pathological levels, then it really becomes a problem, because it also damages other people. But that being said, healthy ego is also important. And I think that healthy ego is more about like knowing who you are,
mm-hmm,
and having kind of a stable sense of self.
mm-hmm,
And if you have a stable sense of self, then that enables you to take ownership of mistakes, because they don't challenge your whole identity. So it's not like, I cannot admit that I'm wrong, because if I do that, then it means I'm bad, and
mm,
then my whole world comes crashing down. And that is what you see with a lot of narcissistic personality types. Um, they have a very fragile sense of self, and that's why they act like that.
mm-hmm,
So they have black and white thinking, everything is all good or all bad, and uh, they will do splitting. So splitting is like, if I'm friends with someone like this, they will, like, they do love bombing, and like, you're perfect, you're wonderful, you're amazing, you're the smartest person I've ever met. And then you commit some like perceived infraction, or you do something that's kind of annoying. No, you're bad, you're evil, you're the worst person I've ever met. And because they cannot accommodate the nuance, and
right.
that has to do with things that happen in childhood, and that has to do with kind of like emotional permanence and stuff like that, that I have to be able to trust that you could be in a bad mood someday, or like one day, and kind of be acting like, oh, I don't like being here, or I'm just not really engaging, but that it doesn't mean that you hate me now.
Mm-hmm.
For instance.
Yeah,
And that's
exactly.
that narcissism coming through, is everything is about you. Every time you behave in a way, it's against me. And so I think that having that fragility of identity, that is exactly what prevents people from being able to take ownership of um, problems and mistakes. And it also makes them more susceptible to like quick fix kind
Mm-hmm.
of magic
Mm,
beans type solutions
right.
because they want to avoid the shame of being perceived as like less than competent.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, there's a higher concentration of that type of personality in the management and leadership of many organizations in our society. So the
And why
higher
is
you
that?
get, leadership, like leadership training, doing workshops with executives is way harder
Mm-hmm.
than doing it, at least in my experience, is way harder than doing it with like an average team of software engineers because, or other like knowledge workers who are really focused on their own expertise because they're not posturing for each other in the moment. They're coming to it as like equals. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
the leadership team, you're likely to have one or two people who are like really gaming that out. And that makes it very difficult to come to good decisions.
And that also means that most organizations are built for that, right? And
Yeah.
supporting this kind of behavior, which is very interesting because then we come back to like the beginning, which is the connection between culture and structure. That we're working on structure to create a different kind of environment, hand in hand. I actually with them then like changing culture, changing perspectives or widening
Mm-hmm.
perspectives, right? To create a space to nurture this kind of coexistence of different kind of perspectives and needs. It's it's like it's so fascinating and it's so exciting to like to just listen to you and you definitely you found your passion in life, hey.
Yeah. When I finished my last political science degree, I thought like, okay, well, I spent all that time. I spent like almost 10 years studying that because I loved it, and then I thought, well, maybe I guess I'm going to be one of those people who never uses my degree, but I actually use it all the time.
See? Well, yeah, I mean, it makes completely sense because it's like if you look at the world out of these kind of lenses, you see this happening in like all kind of different systems, right? And what I'm also, just like taking home with me again today is bottom line, it all comes down to relationships.
Yeah,
It all comes down to relationships, and I cannot like repeat myself
so true. Yeah,
more. And this is like the biggest pain point what we're experiencing on individual level, on like the
yeah,
family level, on community level, like neighborhood level, and obviously organizational level. And then we go like wider, like we talk governance, we talk countries, we talk the world, right? And it's true for all of these systems, right? Because they are
yes.
all social systems. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think a lot of companies neglect that when they treat employees as like fungible resources where you could just move stuff around or you can just cut out a whole piece of the organization and you'll be fine
Mm-hmm.
because they neglect that the intensity of those like individual relationships is not something that can be replicated
Yeah,
with because it's not just the people, but it's like these specific people at this moment of time in this configuration with the
exactly.
bonds that they have together with each other, these specific people. It's not just like you can't design an organization without thinking about the individuals in it. And there is a lot of that, I think, in maybe like corporate and like corporate consulting and corporate org design, where they think about stuff like this operating model. And then we just need to get the people to adapt to it as if the organization and the people are two separate things.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that would be nice. That would make it simple.
Indeed.
Let's use simple to deal with complexity. But yeah. Well, it was such a pleasure. Heather, how can the listeners find you?
I'm on LinkedIn. I also have a WordPress site that I don't write that much on, but I should probably write more. And I guess you can probably share the link in the show notes, but it's
Yes.
expatriate at wordpress.com. So the first expatriate is ATE, like someone who has moved to another country, as I have done. And then the second is expatriate, as in PATRIOT, as someone who is very
Nice.
loyal to a country. Um, yeah, you can find me there. And thank you so much, Tina. I really love talking about this stuff, and I'm honored to be a guest.
No, thank you. And our conversation will continue, I'm sure.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, thank you so much. And yeah, I say bye.
Bye.